When you hear the word hippie, what images come to mind? Peace, love, and harmony? Perhaps psychedelic drugs, long hair, and tie-dye clothing. Maybe environmentalism, communal living, and anti-war sentiment. What about a carefully engineered military counterintelligence psyop? Could the counterculture icons we know and love have been part of a broader strategy to discredit the anti-war movement by associating it with rampant drug use, promiscuity, and perceived chaos? This strategy, often linked to scandals or controversial figures, might have served to steer public perception away from activism and toward fear. By fostering an image of anarchy and deviance, it paved the way for stricter governmental controls and justified policies like the war on drugs, which enabled the militarization of local police forces across the nation. Welcome to Convergence Points, the channel where we attempt to create context where others see only chaos. Today, we dive deep into the enigmatic tales of Laurel Canyon, the classified secrets of Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, and the shadowy depths of MK-ULTRA. History's threads often weave strange connections, creating narratives that defy simple explanations. From Laurel Canyon's creative hub, where legendary musicians and artists converged, to Lookout Mountain's hidden film studio, lies a tale that intertwines art, culture, and clandestine operations. Together, we'll explore how these elements form a narrative far too intricate to dismiss as mere coincidence. Convergence Points is your portal to these hidden histories. Together, we'll unravel mysteries, challenge assumptions, and open the door to critical thinking. Join us on this journey as we step into the shadows of Laurel Canyon. On the morning of August 4th, 1964, U.S. intelligence intercepted a report indicating that the North Vietnamese intended to conduct offensive maritime operations in the Gulf of Tonkin. Just 2 days earlier, the USS Maddox, part of the 3rd Fleet Carrier Division, had a brief skirmish with North Vietnamese torpedo boats patrolling the coast. The Maddox sustained minor damage, a single shell strike, while 3 NVA torpedo boats ended up at the bottom of the Gulf. That night, the Maddox, now joined by the USS Turner Joy, reported hostile contacts approaching from 3 directions. Over the next 3 hours, the 2 destroyers conducted evasive maneuvers, reporting automatic weapons fire, over 20 torpedo attacks, and sightings of torpedo wakes, enemy searchlights, and numerous radar and sonar contacts. When the smoke cleared, the U.S. destroyers had unleashed a staggering response. 249 5-inch shells, 123 3-inch shells, and 4 or 5 depth charges, depending on reports. And yet, there was no evidence of an attack. Commander James Stockdale, commanding officer of the VF-51 Screaming Eagles, had launched solo from the USS Ticonderoga in his F-8 Crusader to provide air support. From his vantage point, Stockdale would later recount, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event. Our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There were no PT boats there. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." Now, this wasn't just any witness. Commander Stockdale would later go on to earn the Medal of Honor for his actions as a POW after being shot down later in the war. Over 7 years in the infamous Hanoi Hilton, Stockdale endured unspeakable torture as the highest-ranking American officer held captive. According to his Medal of Honor citation, he, quote, deliberately inflicted a near-mortal wound to his person to convince his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate, end quote. The North Vietnamese, convinced of his indomitable spirit, ultimately lessened their excessive harassment and torture of all POWs under their control. If anyone's account could be trusted, it was Stockdale's. Despite this, what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident was used by the Johnson administration to convince Congress to pass the Southeast Asia Resolution. This granted President Johnson the authority to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
Years later, in 2006, declassified documents would confirm that Congress had been deliberately misled. The distortion of events reached the highest levels of command, implicating Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara as well as President Johnson. At the time, the commanding officer of the 3rd Fleet Carrier Division was Captain George Stephen Morrison, aboard his flagship, the USS Bonhomme Richard. Whether Morrison actively shaped the misleading reports or was simply following orders, his career trajectory was remarkable. Just 3 years later, he would be promoted to Rear Admiral, one of the youngest ever to achieve flag rank, a promotion that raises questions even today. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Captain Morrison's son had just begun his first year at UCLA Film School after transferring from Florida State. This young man would go on to become one of the most celebrated icons of the late 60s counterculture movement, a figure synonymous with rebellion and anti-establishment ideals. His name? Mr. Mojo Rising, the Lizard King himself, Jim Morrison. Now, is it merely a coincidence that the son of the officer whose fleet helped justify the Vietnam War became a cultural icon supposedly opposing it? Or does this connection hit at something deeper? Perhaps a broader pattern linking the counterculture to establishment forces operating behind the scenes. Now, I can hear what you're saying already, that Jim Morrison's father being involved with the Gulf of Tonkin is just a weird coincidence. And if this coincidence existed in a vacuum, I might agree with you. The problem is, it doesn't. An inordinately large number of the most prominent figures in the Laurel Canyon scene have similar backgrounds. I'm not just talking about being the children of former U.S. servicemen. There would have been plenty of those after World War II in Korea. Rather, I'm talking about the sons and daughters of admirals, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons engineers, Marine officers who spent the post-World War II era hopping around Central American hotspots, high-ranking intelligence officials, and military propagandists. A good portion of the information in this video comes from the late Dave McGowan's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. McGowan's research provides an essential foundation, uncovering connections between counterculture icons and military-industrial influences. While his work is pivotal, I aim to build on it by focusing on overlooked aspects such as the connections between the Lookout Mountain facility and CIA mind control programs, and offering a more streamlined interpretation for the modern audience. This video is just the beginning. My goal for this channel is to explore the many threads that lead to each convergence point in greater depth, so topics like McGowan's infamous Laurel Canyon death list will be explored in future videos. If this subject intrigues you, I highly recommend picking up a copy of McGowan's book to dive deeper into his work. Now let's get into it. Undoubtedly, the father figure of the Laurel Canyon hippie scene, though he preferred the term freak, was Frank Zappa. Frank and his wife Gail hosted what was essentially an open salon at their sprawling home, a massive residence at the intersection of Laurel Canyon and Lookout Mountain Avenues, dubbed the Log Cabin. Despite its humble name, the Log Cabin was anything but modest. Once home to Hollywood cowboy Tom Mix and his partner, Tony the Wonder Horse, the property was a blend of eccentric luxury and rustic charm. It featured a 2,000 square foot living room, a basement bowling alley, and a fireplace large enough to burn entire logs. The grounds included a labyrinth of mysterious tunnels, both natural and man-made, adding an air of intrigue to the venue. Visitors described the log cabin as a place of controlled chaos, where you might stumble upon late-night jam sessions, impromptu art installations, or whispered conversations about the latest happenings in the canyon. Frank moved to California from Baltimore because his father, Francis Zappa, had transferred from the Edgewood Arsenal at Aberdeen Proving Grounds to teach at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. For those unfamiliar, Edgewood Arsenal was originally established to produce chemical weapons during World War I. Over the decades, it expanded into more controversial territory, becoming a hub for biological weapons development and human experimentation. This work included chemical exposure studies on unwitting subjects as part of Projects Artichoke, 112, and MK-ULTRA, programs notorious for their ethical violations. Francis Zappa's involvement was significant enough that the family kept gas masks at home to guard against potential leaks from his experiments. Frank later referenced germs and germ warfare in his music, and even played with elemental mercury that his father brought home from work, a substance now linked to prostate cancer, the disease that would claim Frank's life in 1993. But Frank wasn't the only Zappa family member with ties to weapons of mass destruction. Gail Zappa, whom Frank met in 1966 at the Whiskey A Go-Go, also came from a military background. Her father, Captain John Klein Sloatman Jr., was a nuclear physicist conducting classified research for the U.S. Navy. Gail herself worked at the Office of Naval Research after attending the same military grade school as Jim Morrison. She later moved to California, becoming the self-proclaimed world's first groupie. So here we have the son of a chemical weapons engineer and the daughter of a nuclear physicist hosting an open salon for hippies, freaks, and drug users, all while openly disdaining the very scene they presided over. Frank, for example, never used drugs stronger than nicotine or caffeine and prohibited his bandmates from indulging. He even barred them from fraternizing with the notoriously drug-permissive Grateful Dead. By all accounts, Frank was authoritarian in his personal life and politically conservative. In a 1986 appearance on Crossfire, he flatly stated, "I'm a conservative." It's curious, isn't it, that a conservative authoritarian would emerge as a central figure in the counterculture? This contrast raises an intriguing question. Was his role reflective of a genuine cultural shift, or could it have been part of a larger, orchestrated effort to influence the scene's direction and image? It raises questions about how much of the scene was spontaneous and how much might have been guided. Speaking of authoritarian figures in the canyon, Stephen Stills provides another compelling example of how establishment influences wove through Laurel Canyon's counterculture. Among his peers, Stills cut such a commanding and controlling figure that they nicknamed him the Sarge. Given his background, the name seems fitting. Stills was the son of William Arthur Stills, a former Marine officer. Interestingly, there's very little information about his father available online. What is known is that, while sending Stephen to prestigious military prep schools like the Admiral Farragut Academy in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the St. Leo College Preparatory School in St. Leo, Florida, to participate in their ROTC programs, the Stills family frequently moved to Central American hotspots like Costa Rica, El Salvador, and the Panama Canal Zone. Can someone say, company business? Stills had a penchant for proclaiming to anyone in earshot that he had served time in the jungles of Vietnam. These claims, whether fact or fabrication, added to his mystique as a larger-than-life figure and underscored the blurred line between myth and reality that often defined the countercultural movement. Many dismiss these boasts as the ramblings of a cocaine-addled mind, but his military upbringing and education, including that time in ROTC, made the idea less far-fetched than it might initially seem. Early U.S. advisors in Vietnam were often special forces, adding plausibility to such tales. Even without definitive proof, the possibility of some truth remains, further complicating the enigmatic persona of Stills, a man who somehow became an icon of the peace generation despite these contradictions. Let's move on to another central figure in the Laurel Canyon scene and future bandmate of Stills, David Crosby, or should I say, David Van Cortlandt Crosby, because David is descended from the prominent and powerful Van Cortlandt Van Rensselaer Schuyler dynasty. Let's just say if America had a nobility, Crosby would undoubtedly be a member. But his aristocratic lineage isn't the only fascinating facet of his background. David was the son of Academy Award-winning cinematographer Floyd Crosby, or, more precisely, Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. Floyd served in the Army Air Corps 1st Motion Picture Unit, where he collaborated with Hollywood stars like Jimmy Stewart and Ronald Reagan to produce propaganda war films like Winning Your Wings and The Rear Gunner. This unit would later evolve into the team stationed at Lookout Mountain Air Force Station in the heart of Laurel Canyon. As for David, he might have called himself a pacifist, but his behavior often said otherwise. He had a particular penchant for pistols, particularly .45s. Not exactly the image of a peace movement icon, is it? Crosby also wasn't a particularly polished musician when he first joined the Byrds, the first major Laurel Canyon band to release a record. What he did have, though, were powerful connections, most notably to producer and former U.S. Army soldier Jim Dixon of World Pacific Studios. Interestingly, Crosby wasn't the only Byrd with limited musical chops early on. In fact, Jim Roger McGuinn was the only actual band member to play on their debut single, Mr. Tambourine Man, or their entire first album for that matter. The rest of the instrumentation was handled by Phil Spector's famed Wrecking Crew session musicians. Not that the Byrds were the only Laurel Canyon band to make extensive use of Spector's Wrecking Crew. In fact, the instrumentation on the albums of the majority of the bands to come out of the canyon during that period, the Byrds, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Doors, and many others, were played by the Wrecking Crew on some of their biggest hits. This raises an intriguing question. Was the Laurel Canyon sound truly the product of free-spirited counterculture, or was it something far more calculated, crafted to achieve a specific cultural and political outcome? Consider the heavy reliance on session musicians like Phil Spector's famed Wrecking Crew, who played on countless hits attributed to these so-called counterculture bands. Their involvement blurs the line between organic creativity and deliberate orchestration, adding a layer of complexity to this narrative. No band made more extensive use of their services than the one arguably most responsible for turning the hippie movement into a national phenomenon: the Mamas and the Papas. I say band, but really the credit for their success largely falls on one man, their de facto leader, Papa John Phillips. Phillips planned the now world-famous Monterey Pop Festival, a platform that launched many Laurel Canyon acts into superstardom. He also penned the song San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, for his friend Scott McKenzie to promote the festival, which drew teenage runaways from across the country to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco in the summer of 1967. This event famously kicked off the Summer of Love, a phenomenon and time period I plan to delve into further in a future video. As for Papa John, he too was a child of the military-industrial complex. Phillips was the son of Major Claude Andrew Phillips, a Marine Corps officer and World War I veteran. While the specifics of Major Phillips' role in the Corps remains unclear, we do know he was stationed in Haiti and Nicaragua. John Phillips, like so many others in this scene, attended military prep schools. He even received an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, where he attended for his plebe year before resigning to enroll in the exclusive Hampton-Sydney College. Oh, and John's sister Rosie? She worked at the Pentagon. Are we noticing a trend yet? And then there's John Phillips' depravity. This man was so twisted that even with Charles Manson and his family regularly prowling the hills of the canyon, Phillips might take the title of most depraved resident. The allegations made by his daughter Mackenzie are truly sickening. While irrelevant to whether or not Phillips was an intelligence asset, they undeniably cast a dark shadow over his character. Look up the details if you must, but fair warning, you can't unread them. Now, there are countless other musicians McGowan presents in his book as indicative of a scene that might not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. While the following isn't an exhaustive list, I will point out some more who stand out. Like Graham Parsons, the son of a World War II ace pilot and heir to the Snively family fortune. Mike Nesmith, a former Air Force serviceman and yet another heir, this time to the liquid paper fortune. The Members of America, childhood friends who grew up on a U.S. Air Force base in England. Ray Manzarek, Jim Morrison's future bandmate, who served in the highly selective U.S. Army Security Agency before attending UCLA Film School, where he would meet Morrison. What ties these figures together? All of them came from families with significant ties to the military-industrial complex. They held influential roles in their respective bands, and for the most part, Stephen Stills gets a pass here. Their early live performances revealed a level of musicianship that could generously be described as mediocre. But if they weren't very good live, how did these bands get popular in the first place? Well, I'm glad you've asked. That's where the next group of players comes into focus: actors and artists. These two communities played an outsized role in elevating the Laurel Canyon acts, and we're going to take a closer look at two primary groups within them. First, there was the circle of young, hot, up-and-coming actors collectively known as the Young Turks, a group that included Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, Bruce Dern, Warren Beatty, and Jack Nicholson. Then there was the so-called freak scene, led by artist Vito and his band of eccentric performers, often referred to as Vito and his Freakers. Both groups were instrumental in boosting the visibility of Laurel Canyon's musical acts, but in very different ways. The Young Turks used their fame and influence to promote the scene, while Vito's Freakers provided such a chaotic and mesmerizing spectacle during live performances that they distracted audiences from the lackluster musicianship happening on stage. To quote Byrds manager Jim Dixon, "We had them all. We had Jack Nicholson dancing, we had Peter Fonda dancing with Odetta, we had Vito and his Freakers." Picture it. Hollywood stars and unconventional performers converging to create a swirling, surreal atmosphere of movement, color, and energy. One so captivating that the audience's attention rarely stayed on the stage. Vito's troupe would storm dance floors, writhing and spinning wildly to the music in performances that were as spontaneous as they were theatrical. By surrounding the music with visual overload and star-studded glamour, these groups created an atmosphere and amplified the allure of the Laurel Canyon scene. Their combined efforts turned live performances into cultural events, elevating mediocre bands into something far more memorable. At the heart of the freak scene was Vito, a sculptor and artist who moved to Los Angeles after World War II. Vito cultivated a community of eccentric performers, free spirits, and social outcasts who became known as Vito's Freakers. Alongside his partner, Carl Franzoni, nicknamed Captain F***, Vito's troupe became a staple of Laurel Canyon's live music scene, playing an outsized role in its cultural identity. The Freakers were infamous for their wild, uninhibited dancing, which often bordered on performance art. They were regulars at venues like the Whiskey A Go-Go, where their chaotic and mesmerizing antics ensured that any band performing, regardless of skill, would draw a captivated audience. Vito himself once described their performances as a visual explosion, carefully orchestrated to hold attention and mask musical shortcomings. The energy they brought to every event became a key element of the Laurel Canyon mystique. What set Vito's troupe apart was that almost cult-like atmosphere that surrounded them. Members of the Freakers lived communally, often in a single house or studio under Vito's control, with rigid rules about their appearance and behavior. Vito and Carl wielded significant influence over the group, dictating everything from their clothing to how they danced during performances. Some accounts suggest they weren't simply in a group of free-spirited individuals, but rather a carefully curated collective engineered to amplify the allure of the Laurel Canyon scene. The parallels to the Manson family are hard to ignore. Both groups fostered environments of psychological control and charismatic leadership, drawing impressionable followers into a tightly knit, insular community. While Manson's methods were overtly criminal, the Freakers relied on chaotic performances and countercultural aesthetic, blurring the lines between artistic expression and manipulation. These similarities highlight how authority and control could be disguised as free-spirited rebellion. Like Manson, Vito and Carl fostered an environment that obscured the boundaries between collaboration and coercion. While Vito's stated goals revolved around promoting the counterculture's music scene, the dynamics within his group prompted deeper questions about how far their influence extended, and who ultimately benefited from their presence. Vito's backstory is equally fascinating and dark. Born in Massachusetts in 1913, his early life was marked by rebellion and criminal behavior. He spent time in prison for statutory rape before reinventing himself as a sculptor and cultural provocateur. After arriving in Los Angeles, Vito became a fixture in the local art world, creating sculptures and installations while building his unconventional community. His partner, Carl Captain Franzoni, brought an equally eccentric energy to the scene, with a reputation for larger-than-life antics and a penchant for flamboyant self-promotion. Despite this outward embrace of free love and counterculture values, Vito and Carl's methods were far from egalitarian. They operated with an authoritarian edge, controlling their followers in ways that starkly contrasted with the ideals they claimed to embody. For many in their orbit, the Freakers were less a free-spirited collective and more a cult-like experiment in group dynamics, a dynamic that mirrored darker elements of the era, such as the infamous Manson family. In an odd twist of genealogical trivia, Vito's first cousin, Giavute Pauquiet, better known by her stage name Ava Paul, would later become known by Bobo Rockefeller, after marrying future governor of Arkansas Winthrop Rockefeller, son of oil magnate John D. Rockefeller Jr. According to Time magazine, Bobo's parents couldn't attend the wedding because they were too busy on their Indiana farm making Lithuanian cheese. A peculiar anecdote, to say the least. As for Vito, he quickly established himself as an artist and sculptor in Los Angeles after the war, with the LA Times covering exhibitions of his work as early as 1949. Examples of his work, however, remain scarce online. In 1961, Vito married Susan Cynthia Schaefer, better known in the scene as Sue, despite being 30 years her senior. Together, Vito and Sue, along with Carl Captain Demonetized Franzoni and a group of underage, barely clothed dancers, became regular fixtures at local clubs. They were pioneers of what we now think of as hippie fashion and creators of the free-form dance style that came to define the era. Their wild, uninhibited performances at venues like Ciro's and Whiskey A Go-Go became the true spectacle, often stealing the show from the bands on stage. Producer and musician Kim Fowley summed it up succinctly. A band didn't have to be good, as long as the dancers were there. Even Gail Zappa acknowledged the dynamic. The customers came to see the freaks dance. Nobody ever talks about that, but that was the case. Frank Zappa himself added, as soon as they arrived, they would make things happen, because they were dancing in a way nobody had seen before, screaming and yelling out on the floor and doing all kinds of weird things. They were dressed in a way that nobody could believe, and they gave life to everything that was going on. The Freakers' presence didn't just elevate the energy of live performances, it cemented their role as architects of a counterculture aesthetic. Their fashion, dance, and larger-than-life antics became inseparable from the burgeoning Laurel Canyon mystique, ensuring that even lackluster musicians could bask in the glow of a captivated audience. Now, how was it that an artist and sculptor in his 50s managed to attract and maintain a seemingly endless harem of promiscuous women less than half his age? One simple word: drugs. Vito encouraged his followers to drug themselves, particularly with LSD, while abstaining from using the substances himself. This tactic wasn't unique to Vito. Frank Zappa followed a similar pattern, avoiding drugs personally while working within a drug-fueled scene. But there was yet another figure in the canyon who employed this strategy with far darker implications: Charles Manson. Vito and Manson shared more than their approach to drugs. Both saw themselves as visionary artists and spiritual leaders. Both spent much of their young adulthood institutionalized and surrounded themselves with impressionable young women, whom they controlled with strict rules and strange nicknames. Both men also harbored disturbing ideas about exposing children to alternative forms of education on adult themes, using their positions of influence to normalize these beliefs within their groups. The similarities are hard to ignore. One particularly unsettling incident involved Vito and Sue's 2-year-old son, Godot, during a late-night party. Witnesses recounted a gathering where the child was the focus of inappropriate physical attention under the guise of introducing him to sensuality. Accounts from the time suggest a deeply troubling philosophy that blurred boundaries and excused what would normally be unthinkable behavior. Tragically, Godot died not long after, reportedly falling from scaffolding in his father's studio or through a skylight during a photo shoot. Conflicting accounts exist about the exact circumstances, but one fact remains undisputed. Even after their son's death, Vito, Zoo, and the Freakers went out dancing that same night. Vito's ability to attract and manipulate followers mirrored Manson's in chilling ways. Both men built tight-knit, insular communities fueled by a mix of charisma, control, and altered states of consciousness. These environments erased boundaries and encouraged dangerous behavior, turning counterculture ideals into something far more sinister. While these figures defined the counterculture's public face, their personal connections paint a far more enigmatic picture. But what if the scene itself wasn't just a cultural phenomenon, but part of a larger, orchestrated narrative? Like you've got Vito and the Freakers keeping people in the clubs once you've got them there, but what was it that was bringing them there in the first place to watch a bunch of largely unknown acts? That's where the rest of our key players come in, the Young Turks, a group of rising Hollywood stars that included Peter Fonda, Bruce Dern, Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, and Warren Beatty. These actors proved instrumental in drawing crowds to the scene. For many, the chance to rub shoulders with these hip young stars, or their equally famous companions like Jane Fonda, Nancy Sinatra, Jane Mansfield, and Sharon Tate, was a bigger attraction than the music itself. After all, would a young man or woman even notice the band on stage while sharing a table with Beatty, Mansfield, or the Fondas? This union of Hollywood's elite and the Laurel Canyon hippie scene also birthed films that would become touchstones of the counterculture movement. From Jack Nicholson's LSD-influenced writing came The Trip and Head, experimental films that helped popularize the drug use now synonymous with the era. And then there was Easy Rider, created by Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper, which remains a defining cinematic work of the counterculture. While Hopper's background is straightforward, his father was a World War II draftee who left the service at the war's end, Fonda's story provides far more to examine. Peter Fonda, of course, was the son of Hollywood legend Henry Fonda, one of the megastars of the early Hollywood era. Henry voluntarily enlisted in the U.S. Navy during World War II, putting his career on hold to serve as an air combat intelligence officer in the Pacific Theater, where he participated in the planning of the invasion of Iwo Jima. It's almost ironic that Henry's children, Peter and Jane, would later become prominent figures in the burgeoning anti-war movement, a stark contrast to their father's decorated military service. Jane Fonda's highly publicized actions, particularly her controversial trip to North Vietnam, earned her both praise and the disparaging nickname Hanoi Jane. These actions exemplified the stark divide between genuine activism and potential controlled opposition, as her theatrics often undermined the very cause she claimed to support. While publicly aligning herself with the anti-war cause, her behavior frequently came across as more performative than impactful, raising questions about her true intentions in shaping the narrative of dissent. Rather than galvanizing the movement, her actions often seemed to create division, aligning more with the characteristics of controlled opposition than authentic activism. From the films and stars that helped popularize the counterculture to the music that defined its sound, Laurel Canyon seemed to emerge overnight as the epicenter of cultural revolution. A convergence of rising Hollywood stars, experimental musicians, and eccentric artists transformed this secluded area into a creative hub. The involvement of figures with ties to high-ranking military and intelligence backgrounds further fueled speculation about whether this cultural phenomenon was entirely organic or carefully engineered. But this sudden burst of creative energy raises an intriguing question. Why here? What drew these musicians, actors, and artists to this secluded part of Los Angeles, especially at a time when there wasn't much of a live music scene or industry presence in the area? Sure, the weather is nice, but that can be said for most of Southern California. So what exactly made Laurel Canyon so special? Why did so many of these figures, many with ties to high-ranking members of the military and intelligence communities, converge in this one specific area? Jim Morrison's father, Admiral George Stephen Morrison, commanded naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident that escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam. John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas was the son of a Marine Corps officer stationed in Haiti and Nicaragua and organized a festival spotlighting the counterculture music scene. David Crosby, headliner for multiple Laurel Canyon bands, had a father who worked on government projects as an Academy Award-winning cinematographer for the Army Air Corps. Frank Zappa hosted an open salon at his home for all of Laurel Canyon, and his father was a prominent figure in the manufacture of chemical weapons at the notorious Edgewood Arsenal. With so many connections to the establishment among the counterculture's most prominent figures, Laurel Canyon begins to feel less like a coincidence and more like a carefully curated environment. As we've uncovered today, the counterculture movement wasn't just a spontaneous eruption of peace and love. It was shaped by forces operating in the shadows. The influential figures of Laurel Canyon, their military and intelligence ties, and the unsettling dynamics we've explored suggest the story of the 1960s is far more complex than it appears on the surface. But this is only the beginning. In episode 2, we'll dive deeper into the hidden mechanisms behind the manufactured cultural shift. From the enigmatic Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, a facility blending military precision with cinematic deception, to the covert experiments of MK-ULTRA and the societal engineering of the war on drugs. Part 2 will unravel the darker truths lurking beneath the surface of this so-called revolution. Thank you for joining me on this journey in my very first full-length YouTube video. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Even if you want to call me an idiot. Your engagement not only supports this channel, but also helps me guide future topics for us to unravel together. Creating this content is a labor of love, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to watch. Your support means the world to me, and I'm excited to continue exploring these fascinating topics with you. Stay tuned for part 2 of The Shadows of Laurel Canyon. I promise I will try to get it out much faster than I did this one. In that episode, we'll uncover the clandestine operations that shaped the counterculture and examine how the ideals of peace and rebellion were co-opted to serve hidden agendas. Together, we'll shine a light on the unseen forces shaping our world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, question everything.